and I'm almost finished my first year for this research, and I'm looking at how survey measurements represent sex, gender and sexuality in the UK, with a focus on population surveys and those that are most overlooked by current survey practices. So a little bit about my motivation for this research. So when I was asked to describe in one word why I was doing my research once, and the word that came to me was angry. It makes me quite angry that as an agender queer person, I have to lie whenever I fill in surveys because there's just not an option for me to select that accurately represents me. I'm angry at the argument that quantitative methods can't measure the reality of queer lives, so we accept the sort of like inefficient measurements and don't really attempt to improve them. And I'm angry that there is useful survey measurements that could have been that could be applied, but often get prevented due to the politicised nature of representing differences of sex, gender and sexuality. So there's so I think that there's also just like issues surrounding population surveys as a whole, because population surveys have the ability to facilitate sort of intersectional analysis, which is really important, which is why they're my focus in this research. So why does this matter? There's sort of various things about, so first off, as I was just saying about the value of intersectional analysis. So when we look at stuff like the census, it doesn't just measure sex, gender and sexuality, it would also measure ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic background, all these sort of things, and it means that we can look at how all these things overlap to represent the actual lived experiences in the UK, and that's extremely important. When it comes to equality monitoring, there's the significance of, if there's a limited amount of options on a survey, there's a little bit of saying these are the people that matter, these are the people that we are going to meet their needs, and if you don't fit these sort of boxes, then we don't see you as legitimate. So actually having the options that people can be accurately represented is really important. And then there's also just like an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy surrounding this, which is that the sort of gold standard for research is when it's sort of generalisable, reliable, and like we know how valid it is based on like different sort of wider populations when you have a smaller sample. And if we can't estimate the size of LGBTQI population, for example, then we can never really know how representative like smaller research is, and it limits how much that is respected. So I've got this little sort of diagram here just to kind of sum that up. So it ends up that we just don't ask these questions because, oh well, we don't know what size these populations are. So we don't end up addressing them in the same way that we would for other issues. So my research is a 3 strands sequential mixed methods approach it takes, which basically means that I'm kind of breaking down all the different elements of it. So for strand 1, I'm doing a descriptive summary. This strand has already been conducted. So basically I looked at 22 population surveys in the UK that have been conducted between 2011 and will be conducted by 2021, and looked at how they represent sex, gender and sexuality. So basically, do they ask about them, how do they ask about them, and who is overlooked by their approaches to these issues. So the sort of function of this is to get an understanding of what current practice is, because I don't know what's currently happening and I can't like address it, I can't see what's good, I can't see what's bad. So by looking at that, I'll be able to give myself what I'm really assessing for this research. And then the other function of this is to identify what groups are currently overlooked, like who are the people that really are just rendered invisible by the data that we currently have. And then in strand 2, which I'm currently conducting, I'm using focus groups and potentially interviews later on to engage with these groups, to ask them how they kind of feel about the way they're represented using survey measurements, and like would they want to be represented more? Do they think the current measurements just aren't adequate, and do they feel kind of overlooked by them? So the groups that I've identified in Strand 1 were people with variations of sex characteristics, who are also known as intersex folk, people who do not fit within the gender binary, which would be non-binary people like myself, anyone who does not identify with their sex assigned at birth, also known as trans people, and anyone who identifies as somewhere other than heterosexual, gay, bisexual or lesbian. So those are the sort of groups who I'm trying to talk to and find out how they feel about these measurements, and to kind of understand basically really like in the sort of general sense, do they want to be measured, how do they want to be measured, but also like I'll be providing them with specific examples of current measurements and seeing what they think of them in regards, like, is there anything that's already working that's really good? Because that would be fantastic for me to go, this is already working, let's take it and do more of this. Or identifying if there's like a sort of current practice thing that's already happening a lot, which just isn't representing these people. And based on these responses, I will be sort of constructing questions based on the participants' perspectives. I'll be working in that with the participants. So in the focus groups, I'll be like asking them to kind of think of what their ideal question would look like. And I'll be providing them with a sort of example question going, does this sort of thing you have in mind? Is this the correct wording? Would you feel like you could answer this? And I will be testing that in Strand 3, hopefully. So in Strand 3, I'll be basically taking the findings from Strand 2 and seeing if it's more generalisable to a wider LGBTI plus population. So I'll be conducting an online survey to do this with people over the age of 16. And it will be looking at, one, testing those questions to see if these questions that were constructed by Strand 2's participants work for a large variety of people. Do they feel they're represented by them? Would they feel comfortable answering them? Well, that's the really important issues. And then also just checking if, like, the Strand 2 participants' perspectives on these issues, like, how they're represented, if that's generalisable to a wider audience, just to understand if how the most overlooked groups feel on a larger scale. So to kind of bring all that together, I'll basically be taking the findings from Strand 2 and 3 to make a sort of understanding of best practice. And with that understanding of best practice, I'll compare it to Strand 1's findings, so I can see exactly where the current practice is not meeting up with what overlooked groups would need from survey measurements. And from there I could make recommendations for specific ways that population surveys in the UK could be improved upon. So this would be useful. It's specifically looking at population surveys, but part of the benefit of looking at population surveys is that they're kind of the most heavily scrutinised, because they like things like the census have to work for such a large variety of people. If I could make recommendations that work, that could be applied in those settings, it could also be applied in smaller settings for smaller scale research, or even for administrative data reasons, like that sort of thing. So so I've added these sections in just to kind of emphasise the significance of this, and why is this currently the time to do this research. So in 2021 / that should be 2022, that's wrong. The next round of UK censuses will be. So these censuses will be really changing and progressing how sex, gender and sexuality is represented in the UK. Because sexual orientation is going to be represented for the first time, that's across the UK, and trans populations are also going to be represented in Scotland, England and Wales. So when I was saying earlier on about how it's a really heavily politicised debate, and like academics like Sally Hines have emphasised that the politicised nature of this is really unfounded, that we don't normally have such like heated debates surrounding census questions. It's normally like in Scotland, NRS would provide their evidence and the research that was conducted in the questions, and the committees would go, yep, that looks good, correct. There's not normally quite as much contention. The sort of big areas of contention which have kind of passed now, also due to COVID, the debates have kind of been on pause, but we've got to a good point with these, is sexual orientation. So the sexual orientation question is going to have the options heterosexual / straight, gay / lesbian, bisexual, and then an other option. With the other option, there will be space to specify. There was some debate because the space to specify had for the fill-in text box, there was predictive text. So there was some debate over the legitimacy of the other predicted text options. Now, as someone who I would have to use the filling in box, having a predicted text option doesn't change what I would say. I would still say queer. Like, and if anything, from a data and use perspective, it makes it so much easier having that option there, because it means the spelling of all the respondents will be the same and it will be accurate. So that issue is kind of passed. The other main issue was surrounding the sex question. So in 2011, the sex question was a lived sex question, which means that trans men were encouraged to select male and trans women were encouraged to select female based on that's how they lived their lives. There was some debate over switching this to a legal sex question, which the tables to the side here kind of indicate the issues with. So the lived sex question, combined with the trans status question, which will also be there, would tell us, so it would, in the female category, there would be cis women, trans women and non-binary people who feel aligned with the term female, and yeah, basically anyone who's comfortable selecting the term female, and cis men would be the same for, it would be, sorry, the male option would be the same, but with cis men, trans men and anyone comfortable selecting male. The legal sex option would confuse that slightly, because legally, so under female, for example, there would be cis women, there would be trans women that have a gender recognition certificate, but then there would also be assigned female at birth trans men and non-binary people. And we would have data saying that some of these people are trans, but we wouldn't know in what sense they are trans. So if anything, if you're wanting data that indicates who trans people are in a sample, that's a more confusing estimate. So it was more just to kind of enforce this idea that there is a legal sex and that there is something concrete there, rather than to produce more usable data. But luckily, these debates have kind of passed. The lived sex guidance does seem to be what is going to be selected, which means that the 2022 in Scotland now, the census data will be of extreme use, because it means that we'll be able to see exactly the sort of demographics of the trans population. The only sort of fallback on this is that NRS did have significant evidence that non-binary people should be included, that it should be a male, female, like in another way option for the census question, but that was not selected due to the politicised nature of this debate. So I've ended up here with a quote from, so this is from near the beginning of the lockdown. Dr. Kevin Guy wrote an article called When the Dust Settles, it's called. How do I go back now? There we go. And it was basically about the significance of equality, diversity, inclusion data during this time. So in a time of crisis, there's the temptation to scope data, not important, just put it to the side, it's just numbers, it's just pedantic bureaucracy, it's not important at this time. However, it is really essential to making sure that overlooked groups and the marginalised populations in the UK their needs are being met, and it's not just a sort of generalised sort of the normative group in the UK that are being catered to during this pandemic. In that article, there was emphasis on the ways that it might have that COVID might have specific impacts on LGBTQ+ populations. So in regards to health outcomes, there generally tends to be worse general health in the LGBTQ+ population. And then in regards to lockdown and being isolated and having to stay with family, that might mean having to go back into the closet for some people. For trans people specifically, there was a lot of concerns around trans-related healthcare and having access to that during lockdown, and like the worry of that being seen as non-essential when it is really integral to people's lives. So these were all like important. These things all emphasise the significance of measuring sex, gender and sexuality during times like this, and also the significance of intersectional data when it comes to looking at specific groups and specifically how they're impacted. So, for example, UK government reports have shown that people of colour are disproportionately impacted by COVID, both getting it and then general outcomes because of it. But this is also intersects with elements of class and occupation, because people might be more likely to be in occupations where they are exposed to it. and meeting the needs of these things, and identifying inequalities in the UK this way is integral to how we should be progressing during times of crisis. So yeah, that's some citations. I think that was actually quite quick, and I apologise for that. Yeah, I'm now open to any questions.